The gender regime of the American family. First, terms. A lot of us use these terms interchangeably, but in scholarly or scientific writing, they are often used very specifically. Sex refers to the biological characteristics that distinguish men from women. Chromosomes, genitalia are secondary sexual characteristics. Gender refers to the social and cultural characteristics that distinguish women from men. These can differ widely from culture to culture and across time. Symbolic interactionists argue that our gender is something we learn to enact and perform, and that our society teaches expected gender role behavior, ranging from social norms about dress, body language, and more. Sex is biological, although even biological sex can be more complicated than male or female, considering that about 1% of the population are born medically intersex, meaning with one of more than a dozen different conditions which cause the infant to be born with both male and female or intermediate sexual characteristics, or chromosomes that diverge from the typical XX or XY, such as syndromes like Klinefelter's or Turner's syndromes. And in some cultures and in some points in history, a person's sex and his or her gender were not necessarily matched. Or you could be assigned one sex at birth, but be allowed to change it later on, such as among the Native American Two-Spirit people or the Muxe of Mexico, topics that may be explored in greater detail in your reading. One final term you should know is this one, gender regime, meaning who has access to resources, who earns the family's money, and who has decision-making power over how it's spent. The gender regime of the American family has undergone changes throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. Going back to the colonial era and even farther, we see that, so far as the law was concerned, marriage was a contract between non-equals. Wedding vows, dating to the medieval times, had brides pledging to love, honor, and obey their husbands. Traditionally, men were mostly responsible for the financial support of women, although women of the past certainly pulled their share of the weight, keeping their families, farms, and households, and businesses running. But men also had a certain amount of legal control over their wives. English law, and eventually the laws of most American states, practiced something called the principle of coverture. Upon her marriage, a wife's legal identity was absorbed by that of her husband. She could no longer own property, even property she came into the marriage with, or earnings she made from work. She also could not enter into legal contracts or represent herself in court. And of course, she could not vote. Men were allowed to, even expected to, physically discipline their wives, like they might their children, by beating, spanking, or whipping them. The first American state to explicitly outlaw wife beating was Tennessee in 1850. Over the last century, in most parts of the world, women and many men have worked together to make enormous progress in breaking down barriers to equality between the sexes. The so-called suffragettes fought for women's suffrage, meaning the right of women to vote, and won it in 1920 via the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Activists in the Victorian era fought to grant married women the right to keep control of their property, to divorce, and to be protected from domestic violence. One cultural change that had a huge impact on the gender regime of the American family was the mass entry of women into the workplace over the course of the 20th century. The ideal of the male breadwinner, female homemaker family, wherein dad works for pay and mom stays home and keeps the house running, was actually always something that was restricted to upper class, mostly white women, and it was more or less an invention of certain periods of time. Most colonial women, for example, would have worked right alongside their husbands in farms or businesses. Women of the medieval era and going farther back would have done the same thing. And, of course, children who were old enough to work, so over the age of, say, 4 or 5, would have worked right alongside their parents. The Victorian era brought a different ideal into play. Having enough money at this time to allow your wife and children to not work was considered a mark of financial status. Wealthy women in the Victorian era would not have been expected to work alongside their husbands in their businesses, on farms, or in factories, for example.
They would have been in charge instead of supervising a household of servants, or in some states, slaves. But women of most other social classes worked, as did children of most other social classes. As domestics, maids, or nannies in other people's home, for example, in factories, both children and adults worked in factories up until the 1920s or 30s when child labor laws came into play, often working the same incredibly long hours as adults did in very dangerous conditions. Children and women worked alongside adult men on farms, and women did other sorts of tasks that were restricted to them or most commonly performed by them, like taking in sewing, doing piecework, or doing laundry for other people.
However, over the course of the last century, the idea that women shouldn't be working for money, unless their family was too poor to do otherwise, began to change. In 1900, less than 20% of women worked for wages outside their homes. But by 2024, that had gone up to 57%. Black women lead all groups in labor force participation at about 60%. Hispanic and Asian women are next at about 58%, and white women at about 57%.
One thing that really spurred female entry into the labor force was World War II. Because so many young men enlisted, it created a major need for women to join the war effort by taking jobs in manufacturing, in civil service like transportation and retail, and in other kinds of sectors too, sectors that had formerly been reserved for men. The nation's major magazines devoted their September 1943 covers to portrayals of women in war jobs, creating approximately 125 million advertisements. You probably recognize the one on the left. That's the iconic Rosie the Riveter, We Can Do It. She dates in this era during a mass propaganda campaign that reached out to American women to try to convince them that working outside the home, even in very physically demanding traditionally male jobs like factory work, for example, was something that was not only acceptable but required of them as their patriotic duty. The Rosie the Riveter that you're most familiar with on the left was actually inspired by a Norman Rockwell painting you see here on the right. Um, an image also called Rosie the Riveter. You see her in a little bit more detail here. She's proud of herself, sitting on top of a concrete pillar in the workplace, holding a rivet gun in her lap, eating a sandwich on her lunch break, with her protective eye gear pushed up on her forehead. And if you look down at the very bottom, you can see that her foot is resting on a copy of Mein Kampf, which was Hitler's biography. So this Rosie the Riveter was shown not only as strong and capable, a necessary part of the American labor force, but also someone who was helping to defeat Hitler through her efforts. From U.S. entry into World War II, the number of wage earning women increased from 12 million, about a quarter of the total workforce, to 18 million, about a third of the workforce, by the end of the war. This is actually probably an underestimate of the number of women who were working at wartime, because it didn't include women who, say, worked for a family business, taking over a small grocery store and its daily operations after their husband left for the front, for example, or women who worked on family farms, or women who earned money while their husbands were away by taking in washing or doing daycare for other working women, for example. Many of these women who were working were incorporated into higher paying men's jobs for the first time, jobs in the industrial and transportation sectors that had been completely closed not just to women, but also, because of their relatively high status and relatively high pay, also closed to most non whites before the war. Approximately 75% of women employed in war jobs indicated that they wanted to continue working after war's end. 90% of these women wanted to keep their same or similar jobs. So, by all accounts, women actually enjoyed the work they were doing. They'd gotten used to earning men's wages and getting men's respect for the kinds of jobs they were doing, and they didn't want to switch back to traditional quote unquote women's jobs like waitressing or retail after the war ended. Satisfaction among non white women of their jobs was even higher. 94% of non white women expressed a desire to continue working and to continue working in the same kind of jobs after the war's end. Of course, because many women had been widowed insofar as their husbands were away fighting, for some women this wasn't just an issue of personal choice, but rather one of financial familial survival. Women's working experience during the Second World War wasn't necessarily an easy one. Female workers were routinely paid less than men for the same jobs, even though, by most measures, their productivity equaled or outstripped men's. However, when the war ended, most female workers were fired or laid off to free up jobs for returning soldiers. At war's end, there was an emphasis on recreating the pre war, male dominant family structure. Many servicemen returned to find their wives and households very different from when they'd left them. Women who had been both running and financially supporting their households for the last 5 years didn't suddenly want to revert to serving and taking orders from their husbands, or to turn over all the cash they'd earned working on the assembly line to his discretion. However, there was a strong movement in the 1950s to try to get women to resume their old places in the family hierarchy because it was thought to help soldiers readjust to peacetime by reassuring them they were still in charge. There was also a real social fear that women were getting out of hand. The strong post war economy facilitated this by allowing more families to get by on one wage. Unionization was pretty strong in this period, and most labor unions had fought for what was called a family wage, arguing that employers needed to pay each male employee enough to support himself, a stay at home wife, and their children. Unions fought to bring male wages up across manufacturing industries using this rationale, and mostly succeeded. And so the financial requirement that women work suddenly faded away, and women were pressured to go back home. The images of strong, powerful, rather swole women that dominated advertising during the war era were suddenly replaced by 1950s images of women as charmingly weak and incompetent, dependent, delicate, and definitely less powerful. Like this one for an easy open ketchup bottle. You mean a woman can open it? For many women who had spent the 1940s handling industrial welding torches and rivet guns, media images that depicted them as too helpless to open a ketchup bottle represented a humiliating and unwelcome change. This push to return to the home wasn't welcomed by all women at the end of the war. Many women found housework boring and repetitive. Technological advances in household labor and the shift of production and of food and other necessities from home to market began to decrease the time necessary to run a household. Each new labor-saving device that was invented and introduced, the electric washing machine, the vacuum, the electric stove, the iron, the dishwasher, the crock pot, the microwave, all promised that housewives could look forward to a future where they'd spend most of their days with their feet up. That didn't entirely happen. Mostly what happened was that the standards of cleanliness that the American home was expected to reach simply just kept going up. In the days before vacuum cleaners were introduced, for example, spring cleaning, when everyone drug their rugs outside and beat the dust out of them, happened once a year. With the introduction of the vacuum, women were now expected to clean their rugs at least weekly. Clothes were once worn for weeks without being washed. Now we expect them to be clean every time we put them on. So paradoxically, each new labor-saving device often increased the expectations on housewives rather than decreasing them. But still, a post-World War II house took less effort to run than a Victorian household did, and women of the 50s began to push for more choices and options for themselves and their daughters. The genie was out of the bottle. Until the civil rights gains of the 1960s, outright discrimination in hiring or pay on the basis of either sex or race wasn't illegal. Employers were allowed to refuse to hire women or non-whites, to openly pay them less, and to fire women once they got married or pregnant. That began to change with the passage of laws like the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a landmark civil rights and U.S. labor law in the United States that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It ended unequal application of voter registration requirements and racial segregation in schools, in workplaces, and in facilities that serve the general public, like restaurants, for example, facilities known as public accommodations. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 began as a racial equality bill only, one aimed at outlawing racial segregation in the South. It had nothing at all to do with women's rights until one Southern senator, a Democrat, Howard W. Smith, and an avid segregationist, decided that he was going to add language to the bill that he felt would automatically ensure that it failed. Specifically, he added language on sex discrimination as a strategic attempt to keep it from passing. This is poison pill language on a bill. It's something that politicians do a lot. If there's a bill coming through that they don't want to see passed, sometimes they'll maneuver to get some sort of very unpopular clause written into it, something that'll guarantee that their colleagues have to vote it down. Smith did this by adding sex discrimination to the Civil Rights Act of 1964. To him, the idea that Congress would pass a bill making it illegal to discriminate against women in hiring or housing or education was laughable. This backfired. The bill actually passed, and thus women were accidentally added to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and thus protected.
Later in the 20th century, activists in what came to be called the women's liberation, and eventually the feminist movement, continued to push for equal opportunities for women, and they had their work cut out for them. Many colleges and universities didn't admit women until the 1970s or later. This was more so for elite colleges. Before the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, women were often barred from getting credit cards or signing leases unless they had permission and a co-signature from a husband, father, or other male relative. Until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, many occupations still had marriage bars, policies which required the instant dismissal of a female employee once she got married. And dismissal of and discrimination against pregnant women in the workplace didn't become illegal until the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978. Long treated as a private or domestic affair that popular media trivialized and joked about, like in this advertisement for coffee, and even police didn't take seriously, women's movement activists organized to open the first battered women's or domestic violence shelter, Haven House, in California in 1964. Today there are approximately 2,477 such shelters operating in the United States, though that isn't enough. In 2019, the Deputy Chief Executive Officer of the Houston Area Women's Shelter told Houston Public Media that around half of all domestic violence victims seeking shelter there are turned away each year due to lack of space. For DV victims who aren't biologically female, there is often no space that will accept them, even though 14% of U.S. men over the age of 18 report experiencing severe physical violence at the hands of a domestic partner in their lifetime. Up until 1970, rape laws often carved out an exception for married couples under a concept sometimes known as continuous consent, the belief that a woman ceded control of her body to her husband upon marriage, much as she once ceded control of her financial assets. The last two states to change their laws to allow for the possibility of rape within marriage were Oklahoma and North Carolina in 1993. No-fault divorce laws, which made divorce easier for both men and women by no longer requiring them to prove abuse, adultery, or abandonment in court, were adopted by all U.S. states. The last holdout was New York in 2010. Making divorce easier was a controversial change that may well have contributed to a spike in the divorce rate, though it also removed barriers to exit for both women and men who found themselves in abusive, coercive, or just very unhappy marriages. The push for bodily autonomy or choice was a keystone of the feminist movement and the focus of some of its most energetic activism. This too was controversial, but by widening women's access to the means to control childbearing, feminist activists believed they opened up options for women to pursue education and work, prevent their families from falling into poverty, leave abusive or unhappy marriages, and even to pursue sexual relationships on their own terms outside of marriage. The 60s and 70s saw some major legislative victories for those activists. In the early 1960s and before, many states banned people from using, prescribing, or disseminating contraception or birth control. Some states simply barred single people from accessing it, but Connecticut barred both single and married folks from using birth control. A legal challenge overturned this. In Griswold v. Connecticut, 1965, a 7-2 majority of the Supreme Court held that, even though the Constitution never mentions a right to privacy, it could be inferred, and thus states like Connecticut didn't have the right to violate marital privacy by telling married couples in particular that they couldn't use birth control. This idea of a right to privacy from government intrusion was broadened in later decisions to non-married folks too, one of which was Roe v. Wade in 1973, wherein the Supreme Court held that the right to privacy also pertained to pregnant women seeking abortion. Roe said states could not ban abortion in the first trimester and could only restrict it in the second, up until viability, in the interest of protecting the mother. However, Roe also held that the right to privacy wasn't absolute. States were allowed to ban abortion post-viability, the point at which a fetus can live outside of its mother, in the interest of safeguarding prenatal life. Roe was incredibly controversial, of course, and from this decision grew a large and very organized pro-life activist community, dedicated to seeing it overturned. In 2022, they saw their own victory, when a now conservative majority Supreme Court overturned Roe in a decision called Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health, which kicked the decision of whether to allow abortion back to individual states. Many states, like Texas, immediately moved to outlaw it almost completely. In his majority opinion on Dobbs, Justice Clarence Thomas wrote that the Supreme Court may turn to examining other past decisions, including Griswold, that established rights, called unenumerated rights, that are not specifically in the Constitution. Should that happen, states may find themselves with more leeway to regulate contraceptive use, or other access to other more generally controversial medical procedures or technologies. What do you think? Should Roe have been upheld or overturned? What about Griswold? Should state and federal governments be able to ban access to things like abortion and contraception? Despite the movement of more women into the labor force, women still experience stratified outcomes there. Women workers have been paid less relative to men, sometimes even in the exact same jobs, since statistics have been kept. Since the 1960s, the wage gap has steadily narrowed somewhat, until the last 2 years when it began slightly widening again. Some of this may have something to do with women's labor force losses during COVID. To draw attention to this issue, an advocacy group called the National Committee on Pay Equity observes something called Equal Pay Day each year. Equal Pay Day is the day women would have to work to in 2024, for example, to match the wages their male co-workers made in 2023. So to match the wages earned in 12 months by male co-workers, a woman would have to work about 15 months.
What do we know about the wage gap and what causes it? Well, one thing we do know is that it appears to be pretty robust across occupations. So, in both male dominated occupations and female dominated occupations, in both low wage occupations and high wage occupations, women make less than men across the board. This chart illustrates the percentage of women's earnings as a percent of men. So basically, if the orange line, exceeded the 100% figure at the bottom, that would represent an occupation in which women were, on average, making more than men. If it reached the 100% mark at the bottom, that would represent an occupation where women and men were paid the same. What we see is that across occupations, there is a persistent wage gap. Maids and housekeepers, which tend to be majority women but not all, still only make about 85% of what male maids and housekeepers do. Among waitstaff, women make less than men. Food preparers still have a wage gap between men and women, although it's a little bit lower. Female food preparers make about 98% of what male food preparers do. The reason for that probably is that most food preparers are making the federal minimum wage. So these are people who work in places like McDonald's, for example, or Wendy's. Minimum wage workers who legally can't be paying less than they already are. Cashiers who are women make less than cashiers that are men. Primary school teachers who are women tend to make less on average than primary school teachers who are men, and this goes on across the board. In fact, the more education a woman has on average, the greater the pay gap. Women trail men in 99% of all occupations nationally. This dynamic is one that we also see when we factor in race, with whites on average making more than non-whites, blacks, Latinos, and Asians, for example, and women of all races making less than men in the same races. We see this in the service industry. If you look at the very top of this chart, Latino women's wages are represented in green, and white men's wages at the very bottom represented in purple. So we see Latino women making less than Latino men, black women making less than black men, white women making less than white men, and white men making most across all occupational categories, or almost all occupational categories. In the service industry, in production and transportation, in construction and maintenance, in professional jobs, office jobs, for example, jobs that require college educations for the most part, and in some cases graduate degrees, and in management, business, and financial occupations, things like being a banker or a stockbroker. We see these wage discrepancies for race and sex being fairly robust.
Looking at the gender wage gap, we do of course understand that some of it is caused by factors like time off from work and occupational segregation. As for child-rearing duties, some social scientists have begun calling this portion of the wage gap the mommy tax, or the motherhood penalty. Women end up doing the lion's share of child and family caretaking responsibilities long beyond pregnancy and infancy. Mothers are still responsible for the majority of school-age children's care as well, and so may continue to experience some work interruptions, such as needing to take time off to stay with a sick child. But studies of childless women still find a wage gap, though it narrows. Single, childless, full-time female workers earn about 93 cents on the dollar compared to their male peers. Full-time employed mothers, on the other hand, earn about 35% less than full-time employed dads, who actually often see a wage jump. We don't know why men's wages rise when they have children. Employers often like hiring, quote, family men because they assume they will be more reliable and dedicated. Bosses may give a new father a small raise, assuming he needs it more. And men with children may also opt to put in longer hours. For whatever reason, over the course of 30 years, this wage penalty equals an average of $600,000 of lost wages across the average woman's career. A second possible explanation for the wage gap is occupational segregation. Some jobs are more male-dominated, computer programmer for example, whereas others are more female-dominated, kindergarten teacher. It turns out that male-dominated jobs just pay more on average than female-dominated ones. So maybe if we could start encouraging more women to be engineers and construction workers rather than social workers and early childhood educators, we'd solve the wage gap. Well, not quite. Because the data tells us that women who do choose those historically male-dominated jobs still make less than men in the same industries. Female software developers make about 83% what their male counterparts make. Female financial managers make about 69% what their male colleagues do. What about men in female-dominated jobs? Male social workers or kindergarten teachers or nurses? Well, they make more too. Male teachers make more than female teachers. Male nurses out-earn female nurses. Male housekeeping staff and restaurant servers earn more than women in the same jobs. Also, historically, the more a job becomes feminized, the more its average wages begin to fall. So, moving women into male-dominated jobs en masse may not do much to erase the wage gap, because once that occupation reaches the tipping point where more women do it than men, wages fall. For example, being a teacher was higher paid and male-dominated up until the Civil War. Men went off to fight, opening up new opportunities for women in classrooms. But as teacher came to be seen as a woman's job, wages fell. Being a secretary or office assistant was male dominated up until World War I for pretty much the same reason. Then, as women began to do it, wages and prestige fell. Economist Jorgen Harris analyzed census data to discover that a jump in female representation in fields is correlated with declining pay over time. It goes in reverse, too. When formerly feminine professions masculinized, the pay and prestige went up. People talk about empowering women by moving them into fields like software engineering, but what they often don't know is that many of the first software engineers were women. In the infancy of computing, computer code was written out by hand and then transferred onto punch cards that early computing machines can read. During World War II and after, the U.S. hired large numbers of computers. Back then, the term computer was a job description. It described a person who could do complicated mathematical calculations by hand, do things like calculate bombing trajectories, or the best way to reduce air drag on an airplane wing. Since so many men were fighting, those early computers were often women. A large proportion, because Uncle Sam was more colorblind during wartime, were African American. These women worked doing day or week-long calculations by hand, analyzing data from wind tunnel tests on prototype B-17s, and then went down the hall to use a bathroom marked colored women. They also had to sit in separate colored-only sections of the lunchroom. Their story was dramatized in the movie Hidden Figures. Many of these computers stayed in the nascent aerospace industry after the war and helped to do the calculations and write the code that took astronauts into space. One shown here, Dorothy Vaughan, became the first black supervisor at NASA. This picture depicts Margaret Hamilton. She was the lead software engineer for the Apollo 11 mission, standing next to the code she developed that helped take astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to the moon. Coding, computing, these used to be seen as women's work because people basically viewed them as typists or secretaries, but with numbers. As these STEM jobs began to masculinize, however, the wages and prestige associated with them grew. This trend represents a real challenge for achieving wage equity if a society tends to undervalue any work, no matter how hard or important, so long as that work is done by women. You may have heard the term glass ceiling. The glass ceiling refers to unseen barriers that make it harder for minorities and women to rise to the upper levels of the professions. We don't always know what is driving it, but we do see evidence of its existence. Even when half or more than half of entry-level employees in certain jobs are women, men may still hold most of the elite positions in that occupation. In 2024, women held almost half of entry-level corporate jobs. But looking at corporate leadership at the C-suite level, this refers to people whose title starts with the word chief, like Chief Executive Officer or CEO. This falls to under a third. Minority women held 19% of entry-level jobs in that same study, but only 7% of C-suite positions. Women are more than half of law students, have been since 2016, and also of law firm associates, that's basically an entry-level lawyer, but only about 28% of law firm partners. Women occupy 28% of seats in Congress, and women of color occupy about 11%. Lots of things can contribute to the glass ceiling, and in any one individual's story there may be a range of factors. Women may experience more discrimination and promotion. A 2025 poll found that 1/4 of women under the age of 50 and 20% of men at that same age said they would not back a qualified female candidate for president, while 13% of men and women over the age of 50 said they wouldn't be open to supporting women for president. If so many potential voters feel that way about electing a hypothetical qualified woman as president, it shouldn't be surprising that there are still hiring managers and supervisors out there who may feel similarly about women in other leadership positions. Women may be more likely to encounter hostile workplaces, and also, some may be more likely to self-select out of certain jobs due to competition from other family obligations.
One other factor that can impede the advancement of both women and men in the labor force, of course, is sexual harassment, something that we've seen a lot more cultural attention being paid to recently. Sex or gender-based harassment, according to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, could include things like unwanted sexual advances, requests for sexual favors, or verbal and physical harassment of a sexual nature. Obviously, it's not just women who suffer this kind of treatment in the workforce or in educational opportunity or in educational institutions. 9 separate men recently came forward with allegations that they endured sexual harassment, sexual assault, or attempted rape, for example, by actor Kevin Spacey. Some of them were underage at the time. The youngest, Anthony Rapp, an actor, was 14 when he said that Spacey attempted to sexually assault him. What the EEOC defines as gender-based harassment is a separate category of offense. It can include offensive but non-sexual remarks about a person's sex or gender. For example, a male colleague telling a female colleague that he just doesn't think that women belong in this kind of work.
Data suggests that 38% of women and about 14% of men report having experienced sexual harassment at work, and about the same percentage report having experienced sexual harassment at school, college, or university. For gay, lesbian, and bisexual individuals, between 35 and 50% said they'd experienced either physical or verbal harassment at work. For people who identify as transgender, it tends to be higher, with 50% reporting such harassment. Only 30% of victims make any kind of formal report. Of those, 75% said that they indicated that they experienced some kind of retaliation afterwards, which may be one reason why reporting rates are so low. The law generally recognizes 2 different types of sexual harassment. The first, quid pro quo, the Latin phrase that means something for something. Quid pro quo harassment is the most commonly recognized form of sexual harassment. It occurs when job benefits, including things like promotions or salary increases, or even shift or work assignments, are made contingent on the provision of sexual favors, usually to an employer or someone else who has the authority to make decisions about employment actions. Or the rejection of an advance results in a tangible employment detriment, the loss of a job benefit described above. What distinguishes hostile work environment harassment from quid pro quo harassment is that in hostile environment harassment, a tangible employment action, such as being fired, need not have occurred for the victim to make a claim. Examples of harassing behavior that can create a hostile or abusive work environment are the display of pornographic pictures or cartoons, touching and grabbing, sexual remarks or jokes, and the physical interference with movement. It's important to note that sexual harassment that creates a hostile or abusive work environment can include behavior of supervisors, coworkers, and non-employees at a work site as well. In addition, the victim of the harassment need not necessarily have been the direct target of the behavior. Most legal regimes that recognize this form of harassment consider harassment to be hostile or abusive only if it is severe and frequent or pervasive enough that a reasonable person would find it so. One famous Supreme Court case hinging on this second form of harassment involves the case Jackson v. Eveleth Taconite Company from 1988. It was the first sexual harassment class action lawsuit, and it involved a mine in Minnesota that began integrating women into jobs in the 1970s, much to the outrage of some of the male employees, some of who began a campaign of vicious sexual harassment. Women miners had their lockers spray painted with slurs, were smeared with feces, and decorated with tampons, used condoms, and hardcore pornography. They received harassing and threatening phone calls and letters, got physically groped, spat on, had their safety equipment tampered with, almost leading to a potentially fatal injury in one case, and their cars in the parking lot vandalized. Supervisors did nothing, or said things like, "Well, darling, if you don't like it, maybe you ought to consider working someplace else." The case ended up going to the Supreme Court and was dramatized in the 2005 movie North Country, starring Charlize Theron.
Women now make up nearly half of the labor force, with most women, including those with young children, working full-time. 74% of employed women work full-time, whereas about 26% work part-time. Women are more likely to be part-time workers than men are. Only about 11% of men are part-time workers. Nevertheless, most women who are employed, including those with very small children, will work a full-time schedule. However, in most families, women still retain primary responsibility for housework and childcare, in some cases shouldering the burden of all of it. In the 1980s, sociologist Arlie Russell Hochschild decided to conduct an interesting study on how men and women, both of whom in couples work full time, share housework and childcare duties. Her methodology was rather unusual. She approached varying groups of couples, heterosexual couples where both the male and the female of the couple worked full time, and asked if she could just hang out in their homes during the day and observe them. So she came over to their houses early in the morning, sat in the kitchen, watched them prepare breakfast, get the kids ready for school, came back after work, watched the preparation of dinner, the washing up, and the getting the kids ready for bed. What she found was that even in households where women worked the same number of hours for pay as their husbands, even in households where women earned as much or more than their husbands, women still retained the majority of responsibility for housework and childcare. She came to call this the second shift in a book published in 1989 by the same title. Basically, it just described how most women work 2 full shifts each day, 8 hours at work, and then a second 8 hour shift at home. Hochschild found that women do so much housework and childcare relative to their male partners that they perform what is essentially an extra month of work every year, just made up of housework and childcare.
Even in households where both partners work full time, time diary studies and surveys tend to show women doing more housework and childcare. From the 60s till now, men's relative contribution to housework and childcare has increased, from about 15% to about 30 to 40% of the total. This is real progress from our grandma's time, though time diary studies also note that domestic work is often still pretty sex segregated, with women taking on more of the daily housework tasks, cooking, laundry, feeding children, changing diapers, etc., and men more likely to take responsibility for what's called occasional housework tasks, lawn or auto care, things that usually aren't done every day, and may be more flexible in terms of when they must be completed. Because they must balance paid work and the second shift, in addition to doing more of the actual housework, women spend about twice as much time multitasking, juggling personal care, paid work, and domestic work and childcare simultaneously. They also carry more of the mental load of household and childcare, anticipating needs, researching options for filling them, making decisions, and monitoring outcomes. This part is a surprising amount of work, and it's endless. It encompasses things like staying on top of the kids' necessary medical and dental appointments, researching and planning for summer camps, making sure that school enrollment happens when it needs to and all the proper forms are submitted, keeping track of shoe and clothing sizes, and the dietary needs and preferences of everyone in the house so that the fridge stays stocked with the right things, and so on, and so on, and so on. Traditionally, economists argued that these discrepancies could be explained by something called social exchange theory, wherein wives might compensate for earning less by contributing more domestically. However, studies suggest that women who earn 50% of the household income still carry more of the second shift, and some show men in female breadwinner relationships doing the least domestic work. I'm going to repeat that. In households where women out-earn men, say she's a lawyer and he's an elementary school teacher, some studies show men doing the least housework and childcare. When asked, both men and women in those relationships will say some version of the same thing. He already has to accept the fact that I out-earn him. It would be too much of an injury to his pride to ask him to do laundry too. And their husbands will echo that. I already have to deal with the fact that she makes more money. I can't be asked to do the laundry as well. Noting that the tremendous strides that women had made in their careers had not been accompanied by changes in the rest of society, Hochschild talked about something she called the stalled revolution. The fact that women and their career and life expectations and experiences have changed dramatically, but workplaces and our laws and policies haven't really adapted to help parents combine work and family any better than they did in 1960. Most men, Hochschild argued, hadn't changed their expectations about family life in the same dramatic fashion either. They may anticipate and even accept or celebrate their wives' careers, but they still tend to assume that the domestic realm is her sphere and maybe ultimately her responsibility.
How do women who work full time and also come home to a second shift of housework and childcare do it? Ollie Russell Hochschild basically found that working mothers sacrificed rest, relaxation, and sleep to juggle all their role demands. She called this the leisure gap. It basically referred to the fact that when men in her study returned from work, they often sort of expected that they would be able to sit down, relax, recoup, and re energize for the next day. That's necessary to some extent. We all need downtime and rest. Women in her study mostly didn't do this. They came home, kicked off their high heels, changed into more comfortable clothing, and went straight to the kitchen to get ready to prepare dinner, do the dishes, get the kids ready for school the next day, put in a load of laundry, and so on. This is what's meant by the leisure gap.
Gender differences in housework start early, and maybe this helps us shed some light on why both the second shift and also the wage gap persist. We are brought up with it. A 2018 study found that parents assign daughters more domestic chores than their sons, but also pay daughters lower allowances for completing those same chores. One analysis found that girls earned about $6.71 on average for doing chores, compared to boys' $13.80. This trend isn't unique to the United States, by the way. British families were found to pay boys more than girls for the same tasks in a 2013 study done by the website Pocket Money. Research by an Australian bank found that girls did 2.7 hours of housework a week and received an average of $45 Australian. Boys about 2.1 hours for $48 Australian. The point of all this is not to make anyone feel guilty or resentful. Actually, the takeaway from this part of the lecture is generally quite positive because it suggests, get this, a simple formula to increase domestic and relationship happiness. Everyone does half. Sit down with your partner or your family members, your roommates, whoever you share a living space with, and figure out a way to divide the work equally. And not just the work, the planning and scheduling, the mental load. Don't just wait to be asked, take initiative. It really does make a huge difference. Researchers found that couples who share domestic labor more equally report greater relationship satisfaction and more frequent sexual intimacy. Yes, there really are people who get paid to research this. Couples who don't report significantly more conflict and resentment. It seems silly to think that success could hinge on laundry, but people are generally happier when they're not feeling overworked and resentful. Beware strategic helplessness. It's your enemy here. Strategic helplessness is when your teenager figures out that they won't be asked to wash the dishes if they accidentally break half of them in the process. Oops, I guess I'm just too clumsy and dumb to help out, Mom. That can get you out of tasks in the short run, but it can lead to contempt and anger in the long run, which are poisonous for a relationship. The inside-outside split, in my opinion, is also pretty suspect. A lot of families will argue that they split chores fairly, but among gender lines. Boys do the, quote, outside jobs, mowing the lawn and taking out the trash. Girls do all the inside work, cooking, cleaning, ironing, doing the dishes, caring for the baby and the pets, and so on. That often isn't fair either, because those outside jobs, what are sometimes called occasional chores, don't need to be done as nearly as often, and they can often be put off. Don't have the energy to mow the grass today? Probably no harm in putting it off until Saturday. You can't put off feeding the kids dinner or changing the baby until Saturday, though. Inside chores are often an everyday, all-day occurrence, and they do need to be split equally. Finally, gatekeeping. In this context, it refers to blocking a helpful partner from participating meaningfully out of fear that those tasks won't be done right or for some other reason. Shared domestic work also means relinquishing a certain amount of control, which can be difficult for some people or anxiety-provoking. A new mother, for example, may discourage her partner from caring for the baby out of the fear that he, or anyone else, just can't do it as well as she can. In some couples, this fear of relinquishing control can be a real barrier to shared participation. This concludes this lecture. Thank you for listening.